you that don't know, Herptiles is a name given to the collection of animals that are either amphibians or reptiles. And actually, the animals we're talking about today are found in the Caribbean, but some of them have also made their way to Florida. Now we're going to treat this like we're on a cruise, so just lay back and sit in your deck chair and watch the world go by. We're going to be out in the Caribbean cruising around in our big ship, and we're going to hit a whole bunch of islands here: the Bahamas, Cuba, the Cayman Islands, Jamaica, Puerto Rico, British Virgin Islands, St. Lucia, and down South America way we're going to hit Colombia, Panama, and Costa Rica in Central America, and then back up to Mexico, and finally in Florida again. While we're on the cruise, you know, cruising is very much associated with eating, so our crew is down below making our dinner and the appropriate desserts. Now there are two categories of herptiles, amphibians and reptiles. Frogs and toads are one group of amphibians, salamanders is the other, and the last one is Caecilians, not those Caecilians. Reptiles have four categories: lizards, crocodilians, snakes, and turtles. Today we're not going to talk about crocodilians. Now, herptiles have traits in common, whether they're amphibians or reptiles. They're all cold-blooded, and they're all vertebrates, which means they have a spinal cord. They don't have any hair, and most of them lay eggs. Of course, remember, being cold-blooded doesn't mean you're a villain. It just means that you can't control your body temperature. So if it's warm and you want to warm up, you have to sit in the sun. If you want to be cooler, you have to either jump in the water or sit in the shade. Now, the biggest difference between being an amphibian and a reptile is that an amphibian goes through a process of metamorphosis. It changes from one form to another. Whereas a reptile is born fully formed, the way it looks as a child is pretty much the way it's going to look as an adult. And they always breathe air. Amphibians have a phase where they're not breathing air, but reptiles always breathe air. Most people are familiar with a frog. They start out as an egg, and then they hatch into a tadpole, which is a water creature. It has gills and a tail to make it easier to swim. The tail starts to disappear as they get older. It starts growing legs. The eyes migrate to the top of the head, and eventually you have a fully grown frog, which looks entirely different from the tadpole. The alligator, in this case here, is a baby, but he looks just like he's going to look when he's an adult, even including the 80 teeth that he has. So let's look at amphibians a little more closely. There are certain things that only amphibians have in terms of traits. They all have moist skin, pretty much except for toads. They all lay eggs, either in moist debris or in water. They usually all have aquatic larvae, and usually the larvae is aquatic and the adults breed in. So let's take a look at one amphibian, the Cuban tree frog. It comes from Cuba, but if you live here in Florida, you might have seen it around. If it wants to cool off, it has to jump into the water. And that was the sound that it makes. It's like a squeaky shoe. Now you notice it's clinging to that limb there, and it does so with toe pads that secrete a mucus and have like a little suction cup on the end. You'll also notice that sometimes the coloring of the frog is a little different. That's because it has skin cells that contain a pigment that can expand and contract depending upon how much heat the animal wants to absorb. So if it wants to get warmer, it can make the pigment cells expand and attract more heat. Wants to get cooler, it can make them shrink. As I said, it's a Cuban tree frog, but it's also found in the Cayman Islands and Bahamas naturally. It has been invading here in Florida, and it's a big problem because it eats other frogs. The native frogs to Florida are much smaller than the Cuban. As I mentioned before, the toe pads secrete a mucus that let it cling to things, and the pigment cells absorb light. Now notice the length there, 5.5 inches. You'll see that's pretty big as far as frogs go. There he is clinging to some glass, and if you take a close-up look, you can see the little suction hooks. He's found in those three areas: Cuba, the Cayman Islands, and the Bahamas. Now, if you were to visit Cuba, one thing you would see is a lot of old cars. The Cuban mechanics are really good at keeping their cars running because the economy is very bad and they really can't afford new ones. If you go to the Cayman Islands, you'll be able to snorkel or scuba in the clear water and see the beautiful fish, coral, etc. And of course, you can always hit the bank and open up an offshore account. If you want to go to the Bahamas, you can probably see a lot of beautiful resorts that they're famous for. They have beautiful clear water and nice sandy beaches. And look how empty it is now because you need a COVID test to get into these places. Just a little bit of science. We're not going to be too technical here. This is a mnemonic phrase that's used to memorize the different categories that scientists use to organize organisms. The science of doing that is called taxonomy, and each of the words in that sentence correspond to a different category. So king is for kingdom, Philip is for phylum, Cain is for class, over is for order, for is for family, crate is for genus, and spaghetti is for species. Now, it's the genus and the species that scientists use when they refer to an animal. Genus is always capitalized, and species is always lowercase, and they're both always written in italics. The way it's organized is a kingdom has many phylums, and phylum has many classes, class has many orders, orders have many families, and so on. And there could be many kingdoms. So, for example, you look at the Cuban tree frog, he's in the Animalia kingdom. He's an animal. Because he's a vertebrate, he's in the Chordata phylum. Amphibia means he's an amphibian. Enora is for frogs and toads. Hylidae is for tree frogs. And the genus and species are what signify the Cuban tree frog. And I'm not even going to try to pronounce that. But there's the key. Amphibia means you are an amphibian. Now, frogs have calls, and you've probably all heard that. Heard a frog make a call, croaking noise. It does that to attract a mate. All males make a croaking noise to attract females, and some females also do it to attract males. And the calls can get pretty elaborate. Now, when the frog is croaking, all it's doing is it's inflating its throat with air. And because frogs' lungs are so weak, it can't keep inhaling air. So it sucks in a big gulp of air and then sort of runs that air back and forth across the vocal cords. Sometimes the air pumps out on the side, sometimes it pumps out in the front. Now, the frog that we heard making that croaking noise is our native Floridian squirrel tree frog. And as you can see, it's very, very small. So compared to the Cuban tree frog, it's a lot smaller, and that's why the Cuban tree frog likes to eat it. Now, in the toad family, we have the giant toad, also known as the cane toad, and the marine toad. And you notice no matter what common name is used, they always use the same genus and species. This toad is a native of Central and South America, but it's been brought to the Caribbean and Florida to help control the cane beetles located in the sugarcane fields. Unfortunately, the toad doesn't know it's only supposed to stay in the sugarcane fields, and so now it's an invasive species that eats whatever it can in and out of the sugarcane fields. It's very large, so you can see it's 9 inches long, and it has a toxic secretion in its back. You heard the sound it makes, sort of like beating a drum. Now the blue shows you where the frog is, or the toad rather, is native to, and the red is where it's invasive now. It's been introduced in all those places, and it's considered an invasive species in all those places. Here's our cane toad a little more close up. You can see the dry, warty skin, and then the parotid gland on the back is where that secretion comes out. It's sort of a milky color, and you definitely want to wash it off your hands if you pick up one of these things. It's also important to keep your pets away from these toads because they could kill the animal if it gets too much of the poison into its system. It has an eardrum there, like all frogs and toads, and this one, because it's a toad, doesn't have webs on its feet, it just has fingers. To give you an idea of what our native tree frog has to contend with, you can see a tiny little thing compared to the invasive Cuban and the invasive marine toad. This is a little frog that's from the Bahamas, and it makes a very pretty noise, sort of like dripping water. It's called the greenhouse frog because it's found in greenhouses a lot, in gardens. It's primarily in Cuba, the Bahamas, and the Cayman Islands, but it has migrated into Florida, so you might see this in your home in Florida. Now what's interesting about this frog is that it doesn't lay eggs in the water, and the eggs don't hatch into tadpoles. The hatchlings are fully formed frogs. They're very small. They don't get more than 1 1/4 inches long. So this is a baby greenhouse frog hatchling. You can see how tiny it is, but it's also got arms and legs and eyes on top of its head and no tail, so it's fully formed. As I said, you might see them in Florida. This is one that I actually caught in my house. I released it. So this other one got stuck in my window somehow, and I didn't find it till it was all dried up. You can see it's only about 2 centimeters long. The greenhouse frog has a cousin in Puerto Rico called the common coqui, and it gets that name from the noise it makes. The co part of the call is supposed to drive away rivals, and the key part of the call is supposed to attract the females. And it's very popular in Puerto Rican culture. Songs about it, there are stories about it. You can see here it is in the graffiti. And that's the sound it makes. It's the most common frog in Puerto Rico, although there are others of the same genus with different species, and it's only found in Puerto Rico. Very small, 1.5 inches at the most. Now, Puerto Rico is one of the islands in the Caribbean settled by the Spanish. It's way out here, east of Cuba, and the island of Hispaniola, which is where Haiti and the Dominican Republic are. And because it was settled by the Spanish, and they had rivals and pirates in the Caribbean, they built a lot of forts to keep those rivals away. You can see this immense fort down in San Juan, Puerto Rico. If we take a look at it from the ground level, you can see how big it is by noting how small the people are in relation to the walls and the area. Puerto Rico is also noted for beautiful rainforests, and it has many national parks. And what has more lives than a cat? A frog, because he croaks every night. Moving on to salamanders, it's a little bit complicated. They do have 3 stages of life, larva, juvenile, and adult. But there are actually 4 kinds of salamanders. One kind is called salamanders, the other kind is called newts, and then we have sirens and amphiuma. Now salamanders go through 3 stages of life. They're aquatic larval stage, then they're juvenile, but they're still aquatic, and then they become a terrestrial adult. They live on the land primarily. Newts start out as aquatic larvae. They become terrestrial as juveniles, and then they go back more to the water when they're adults. Sirens are always aquatic, and amphiuma are always aquatic. I don't know about you, but I've never heard about newts except in terms of witches. So here's a salamander. Salamander. Starts off as a terrestrial adult, lays an egg in the water. The egg hatches. The larvae has gill buds, so it can breathe in the water. The gill buds develop more, so it can take even in more oxygen. It starts to develop legs, and then it has fully formed legs and fully formed gills, but now it's going to start developing a lung, and it's going to transition from an aquatic juvenile to a terrestrial adult. Newts go through those same phases, but as I said before, the juvenile is a terrestrial. He'll crawl out of the water and develop a lung so it can breathe. And then it goes back to the water as an adult. It doesn't lose its lung. So it's sort of like a sea otter, can come in and out of the water, but it spends a lot of time in the water, and it lays its eggs in the water. The peninsula newt is an example of a newt. This is the terrestrial juvenile phase. Notice the sort of bumpy skin and see how small it is compared to a U.S. quarter. This is the aquatic version, the adult version of that peninsula newt. These are only found in South Florida. Their skin secretes a little toxin, so you want to be careful about picking it up. The eft, that's the juvenile phase, is terrestrial, and the adult is semi-aquatic. It gets to be about 4.5 inches long. The dwarf siren is a type of siren. Looks like a snake, but if you take a close look in the front there, you see it has external gills and it has a tiny foot on each side of the front. It's only got those 2 feet, pretty much vestigial. They don't do much good since it's an aquatic animal anyway. The gills are external. The dwarf siren has 2 subspecies. One's found primarily in the Everglades, and the other is found in other sections of South Florida. It gets to be a little bit long, almost 10 inches. Amphiuma is the 4th kind of salamander, and it looks like an eel. It has 4 tiny legs. You can see here the 2 ones in the front. Don't see any external gills because they're internal. And it's got a very small eye, but it has a strong bite, so you want to be careful picking them up. And 45, 46 inches is almost 4 feet long, so that's pretty big. Now, just to make it a little more confusing, in the Western Hemisphere, this is the range for salamanders, but sirens and amphiuma, those types of salamanders, are only found in the United States, and newts are only found in North America. So the salamanders are what you will see in South, Central America, and also North America. So here's 2 examples of those salamanders. They're both called lungless, meaning they don't have lungs. So how do they breathe if they don't have lungs and they don't have gills? There's a process called diffusion, where they sort of force the air into their skin or through mucous membranes in their throat and mouth. The one on the top is found in Mexico and Central America. The little smaller one is found in Panama and the northern part of Colombia. Caecilians, again, not these kinds, the last group of amphibians. They're very worm-like. We don't know too much about them because they spend a lot of time underground. There aren't any in North America or the Caribbean islands. They're aquatic larvae, which then become these terrestrial underground animals. They're very fierce predators, they have strong bite. So one type is called the Thompson Caecilian, and it had to be pretty long, and even if you take a close-up look at it, it doesn't seem to get any better looking. It's endemic to Colombia, only found there, and yes, it's 5 feet long. So you can imagine a 5-foot-long worm that weighs about 2 pounds and has toxic glands in the skin, and it's a very strong bite. You want to try to stay away from those. Colombia, down here in South America, has sort of a bad reputation because of the drugs and other things, but it's a very pretty country. And here's one of the seaside towns, Cartagena, very old town. See the old town there in the front and the more modern skyscraper version of it in the back. The old town has a lot of pretty Spanish architecture, Spanish colonial architecture. On the right side there, you see a bit of the stone wall that formed the wall around the city when they were fortified against the pirates of the Caribbean. The city has beautiful narrow streets, a lot of balconies covered with flowers and nice woodwork. It's a very pretty place to drive around and walk around. And of course, since it's fortified, it's got a cannon. The Vulcan slender Caecilian is another one. It's not this Vulcan they're referring to. Here's a close-up. You can see it's got a sort of an eye that can really only detect light and dark. Very small nose and a chemical sensor tentacle in the front. Got 2 sets of teeth, outer and inner mandibula, so it's got a very strong bite. It does what's called a death roll when it bites its prey. It just sort of rolls it around and around and try to kill it. It's located in Costa Rica and Panama, and it's kind of long, almost 14 inches. Down here in Panama, Central America, and Costa Rica there is where you could find this Caecilian. Now, most people know about the Panama Canal. There's a ship there getting ready to go through it. And there I am, ready to take you along. So the way the Panama Canal is set up, the boats have to traverse a mountain range, not very high, but the boats basically go up these liquid steps called locks, and they work their way from the Caribbean over to the Pacific, and from the Pacific back to the Caribbean. And the boats basically float into the locks fill up with water, pushes them up to the next level, they float to the next level, and so on, until they get to the lake up on the top, the Gatun Lake it's called, and then the boats pass each other in the lake, and they work their way down to the other side. They take about 8 to 10 hours to cross from one side to the other, and they run maybe 40 boats a day across the canal. You can see that they have these little engines down next to the boats, and those get tied up to the boats and helps them pull the boats through the canal. The boats don't go under their own power. You can see in this picture there are actually 2 separate channels, one for the boats going east to west, and the others for the boats going west to east. Here you see the locks, partially filled with water, and then totally full. Costa Rica is famous for what are called cloud forests. They're basically rainforests that are on top of the mountain, and the water, the air that gets moist from the water, goes up the sides of the mountain, forms big clouds, it sets of condensation. So you look like you're walking through a cloud. They have these suspended bridges through the canopy of the trees where you can walk, and you actually feel like you actually are up in the canopy of the tree. It's a little less stressful than zip lining. So I did it. Walked across the cloud forest walk and ended up eventually at the top of the mountain. Okay, let's switch to reptiles. They're the class called Reptilia. And we have these 4 categories that I mentioned before, but we're not going to discuss crocodilians. Now, things that make a reptile are the fact that it has dry, scaly skin and not moist skin. They usually lay eggs, and when they do, they're dry eggs laid on land, not in the water. Some reptiles have live birth. They're born fully formed, whether they hatch from eggs or live birth. They look the same way they're going to look when they become an adult, and they always breathe air. So sea turtles are a good example. They spend most of their life in the ocean, but they come up on land because they have to bury their eggs in the sand. They lay their eggs in a hole, cover the hole, they leave, and then 2 months later the babies hatch. And when the babies hatch, they're fully formed, they zip out into the water, and they stay in the water for years and years until they're old enough, the females, to come back to the beach where they were born and lay another generation of eggs. Lizards are the first type of reptile we'll talk about. This dwarf gecko is found only in the Virgin Islands. Tiny little thing, you can see there. Its eye has a round pupil because it spends a lot of time out in the daytime. And like most geckos, it has a clear scale over its eye. And to keep it clean, it actually licks that scale. So try doing that at home. It was discovered in 1964, and even on the 3 islands where it's found, it's only found on 3 of the 60 British Virgin Islands. Even on those islands, it's only located in moist microhabitats because it has to be moist. And, the clear scales have to be cleaned by its tongue. It's got no eyelids. And what's interesting about the geckos and other lizards is they have adhesive toe pads. They're not like the suction cups of frogs. They're a little bit different. And this particular gecko is very small. It's one of the smallest lizards in the world. So we'll take a closer look at its feet. And you've got these appendages on the bottom of each toe. If you look at them closely, they're very, very, very microscopic hairs. And those hairs provide an attractive force that allow the gecko and other lizards to climb on walls and ceilings and all around anywhere they want to go. Such an interesting force that scientists are trying to create it artificially and make things like robots that can climb on walls and ceilings. They're also trying to work on devices that astronauts can use to walk around the spaceship by clinging to the walls. So the gecko we just looked at is located only in the Virgin Islands up here, and like I said, only in 3 of the islands. The British Virgin Islands are beautiful. There's our boat in the water. A lot of the islands have these sandy beaches with very large boulders that are basically cooled down, broken up volcanic lava from eons ago. And you can see how big these boulders are by comparing them to the people in the picture. And just like many places in the Caribbean, the water is beautiful and clear and ideal for snorkeling or swimming or scuba diving. Another gecko I wanted to mention is the tropical house gecko. It's very prevalent in the Caribbean. It started out in Southeast Asia, but now it's all over the place. It likes warm, humid areas, and it has clear scales over its eyes. But one of the reasons they call it a house gecko is because a lot of Caribbean cultures consider it good luck, and they like having it in the house. One of the reasons they like having it in the house is because it eats a lot of insects, particularly at night. And because it's a nocturnal animal and it needs more light, it has these slit pupils. So it does have a clear scale like most geckos, but it has slit pupils instead of round pupils so that they can let in more light. Another lizard that you can find in Cuba is the night anole. This one is the largest of the anole species. It's originated in Cuba, but now it's found in Florida, mostly just South Florida because it doesn't like the cold. It's the largest of the anole species, and you can see it, or you can differentiate it from others by this yellow streaks that it has on its face. It's pretty big, almost 20 inches, so it can eat anything it wants. It likes climbing in the trees. It's very arboreal. Cuban brown anole is another one you'll see here in Florida, even though it's originally from Cuba. It's also native to the Bahamas. The color can darken. It doesn't change color so much, just darkens a little bit because of temperature or temperament. Particularly when it's mating, it likes to get very, very dark to help attract a mate. It eats insects, other lizards, and eggs of lizards, and it can be about 9 inches long. Here's a picture of one that we have right here in the Naples Preserve. The adults, the males anyway, tend to get these ridges on their back so they can look bigger from the side. It helps defend their territory while they're mating. And also to help attract a female, we have this dewlap that comes out of the throat to help attract the female. They also do these push-up things to make them look bigger and scare away rivals. Now, green anole, some people confuse the green and the brown anole, but the green anole is the one that is native to Florida, and it's this bright green color. Now, the reason for the confusion is it can turn brown if it wants to. Not to be a chameleon or anything, but sometimes based on temperature or temperament, it'll turn to a faded brown color. Here it is clinging to a wall, just like most lizards can do. And there it is giving its dewlap display, the pink dewlap instead of the bright red. Now, one thing they've noticed is that brown anoles are more aggressive than the green anole. So they've been driving them up the trees. The green anoles are now going up into the treetops for safety. And so scientists have determined that certain populations of them are evolving larger feet so that they can cling better. And this is just a side-by-side comparison. So you see the difference. The green has a little bit more streamlined nose, for one thing. Now the dewlap display, it's not like the frogs. They're not inflating their throat. They're just pushing out their skin with a bit of bone and muscle. And the dark red would be the brown anole, and the sort of pinkish would be from the green anole. The six-line race runner is a lizard that's seen mostly on the ground. It's very fast. That's why it gets that name. When it's a juvenile, it has a bluish tail, and it likes to hide in burrows for safety. And like most lizards, it can lose the tail. The tail can drop off when a lizard is faced with a predator, and the tail will keep wiggling and sort of distract the predator, and then the lizard hopefully runs away. The tail can grow back, takes several weeks. The new tail has no bones in it, it's all cartilage. This guy, the six-line race runner, is found in the US. It's a native to the US and also Mexico. It eats insects and other invertebrates and gets to be about 10.5 inches long. Now, speaking of Mexico, the Caribbean coast of Mexico in particular is a nice place to visit because they have some Mayan ruins there in a place called Tulum. Very, very interesting, and it's a beautiful setting. It's right on the coast. The rainbow whiptail lizard is a cousin of the race runner. Notice it's got the same genus, but the tail is a lot longer. That's why they call it a whiptail. And some of the whiptails are parthenogenic, which means that the females can reproduce on their own. They don't need a male to get fertilized eggs. And they're a little longer than the race runner because of the longer tail. And beautiful coloring, and they're omnivores. They eat both invertebrates, other animals, and fruit. You can see the fighting that occurs. Males fight with males, females fight with females for territory. This little video shows the whiptail trying to eat. And you can see in that video that, like most reptiles, the whiptail lizard can't chew. It always has to break up its food by just chomping on it until it breaks apart or swallow it whole. And you can see the beautiful coloring here. The blue head is usually for the males. Now this lizard here is not so much found in the Caribbean, but I wanted to show it to you because it's unusual, because it's a lizard that doesn't have any legs. And most people confuse it with a snake, but because it has eyelids, that's one way of knowing it's not a snake. It's called a glass lizard because if you handle it, it's very likely to have its tail fall off, and the tail might break into pieces, which is why they call it glass. It's originally found in Florida, but has now been found in the Grand Cayman Islands. They get to be pretty long. The green iguana is another lizard. This one was originally from South America, like a lot of them are, and it's somehow made its way around the Caribbean. And of course, it's in Florida, as you probably know. You might have heard about them falling off of trees when the weather is cold. That's because these cold-blooded animals can't regulate their heat. So if it gets too cold for them, they just basically get stunned. And if it's sitting up in a tree, it might not be able to hang on anymore. It just falls right out. And they're not just green. They can be grayish colors. Long tail, long sharp claws. They have something on their head called a parietal eye. It's a third eye. And we'll see what that looks like in a second. There's another species of iguana called the blue iguana, which is much heavier, almost 4 times as heavy as the green iguana. And here we see a close-up of the parietal eye on the top. It's the heaviest of the iguana species, and it's only found in the Grand Cayman Islands. It's a little bit shorter, but it weighs a lot more. It's about 30 pounds, whereas the green iguanas may weigh more like 8 or 9 pounds. Snakes. What everybody knows about snakes is they have no legs. Some people don't know that the snakes have no eyelids. Their eyes are covered with a clear scale. They don't have external ears. They hear more by vibrations through the bones of their body. And they have a forked tongue. They periodically shed their entire skin because maybe it's dirty, it's covered with mites, or they're just growing and they need more space to grow. As you know, because they don't have legs, they have to crawl to get around. Here's a close-up of a snake. It's got the round pupils, which I mentioned before, means it's more of a snake that's going to be found rummaging around in the daytime. It's got the cleared scale and then the forked tongue. Now the forked tongue enables it to smell direction. Okay, it sticks out its tongue, it senses air molecules, it brings its tongue back into its mouth. The tongue touches something called a Jacobson organ on the top of the mouth, and then it can see which direction thing is that it's smelling. There are 3 families of snakes. We have vipers, which have long fangs. They're always venomous. We have Elapids, which have short fangs, and they're always venomous. And then we have Colubrids, which don't have any fangs usually. Most breed of Colubrids, most species don't have venom, at least the ones in the Western Hemisphere. Now, vipers are also known as pit vipers because they have this facial pit, this little indentation in the side of their face that has a chemical that enables them to sense differences in temperature. So if they're looking at an animal, even in the dark, their heat image will show the animal very clearly, and you can find that animal just by following the heat. The St. Lucia lancehead is an example of a pit viper. So you can sort of see the pits just behind the nostril there in front of the eyes. And notice that it's got slit pupils because, like many pit vipers, it hunts dawn and dusk, so it needs a little more light to get into those eyes. Now, the St. Lucia lancehead is only found in St. Lucia, tiny island in the Caribbean, and it's threatened with extinction because people don't like snakes, so they harass them. Unfortunately, these snakes like to eat small mammals like mice and rats, so they're very good rodent control. And like most vipers, this St. Lucia lancehead has live birth. It doesn't lay eggs. The eggs sort of form inside the mother, and then they hatch inside the mother, and the babies come out fully formed. Here's St. Lucia way out in the eastern side of the Caribbean. And there's the island of St. Lucia, very small, mountainous. It's got two gigantic peaks, 2,500 feet tall, roughly. One's called Gros Piton, or large pike. The one's called Petit Piton, or small pike. And here's the gross one you can see in the image here. Beautiful view from the top. That's our boat down in the bay there. And this is a view of one of the villages along the coast. The coast is actually beautiful, but sometimes the towns in these Caribbean islands are not so well off. You have tin sheds, shanties, and shacks, so it's very good for them to have cruise ships coming in to get money coming into their economy. This is another viper that you can see in Central America, the bushmaster. He's curled up there like a rattlesnake, but he doesn't have a rattle. It's the largest viper in Central America, found in Panama, Costa Rica, and Nicaragua. It's a little bit unusual because it lays eggs. Most vipers, I mentioned already, have live birth. And not only does it lay eggs, but it guards them. Most reptiles lay their eggs and leave. It eats whatever it wants, pretty much, because it's almost 11 feet long. Elapids are snakes that have short fangs and round pupils, because they're usually out in the day. Their fangs don't flip in and out. The large fangs of a pit viper flip in and out like a switchblade. And the toxin that comes out of an elapid, it's a neurotoxin. It paralyzes you, whereas the toxin that comes out of a pit viper breaks down your blood vessels and your other bodily tissue. It's called the hemotoxin. And pit viper's head is a lot larger than their body, where an elapid's head is just slightly larger than its neck, and it always lays eggs. So here's an example of an elapid. Central American coral snake, very beautiful stripes. Florida, we have an eastern coral snake, and they have a little rhyme that says red against yellow makes a dead fellow. I know it's kind of hard to see yellow there, so I wouldn't bother with the rhyme. Just stay away from snakes in general, because they all have teeth, they all bite. This one is found in South America, south of Mexico, Central America, and the north part of Colombia. Usually very hidden animal, likes to hide in burrows. It will eat lizards as well as other snakes and can be 45 inches long. Colubrids, the last type of snake. Notice it does have teeth, even if this one doesn't have fangs. They have round pupils. Their head is slightly larger than their neck, just like the Elapids, and they always lay eggs. Example of that is this snail sucker, and it gets that name because what it likes to do is bite the head of the snail and then sort of hook the shell of the snail on a tree branch, and then it pulls with its body to try to rip that snail out of its shell. Kind of a tough way to get lunch, right? It's kind of narrow, thin snake, but it can get to be about 2 feet long. Very arboreal or boreal and nocturnal, likes living in shady forests. It's found in Panama, Costa Rica, and Honduras. Last group of animals is turtles. Turtles, everybody knows, has shell, but it's actually 2 shells, carapace shell on the top, plastron shell on the bottom. These shells are covered with a material like your fingernails called keratin. These hexagonal pieces are known as scutes. And there's a shell sort of in between the plastron and the carapace called the bridge. The side view of the turtle shows the spine and the ribs all fused together to make the carapace on the top. This diagram shows what the turtle looks like when he pulls his head and legs into the shell. Almost all turtles can do that. The only ones that really can't are the sea turtles. And the shell, of course, is for protection, but it's not like a cartoon. The shell is part of the turtle's body and it can never come off. So the Kemp's Ridley sea turtle is one of the smallest sea turtles in the world. It's very endangered. Notice it has flippers because it's a sea turtle. It doesn't have legs. You can see here how small it is. That's pretty much full size, 2 foot long top shell. There's mama coming up on the beach to lay her eggs. 2 months later, the babies hatch out of the nest and they head for the water. This is the most endangered of the sea turtles. There are 7 different types of sea turtles in the world. This is the most endangered. Its nests primarily in the Gulf of Mexico, likes to eat scraps and shellfish that it gets off the bottom, so it doesn't stay in very deep water. Now, one of the reasons it's endangered is because of the way it arrives on the beach. Okay, the beach arrival in Spanish is called the arribada, and unlike other sea turtles, it's the arribada done by the Kemp's Ridley is done in the daytime, and the turtles come up in large groups. Now, most other sea turtles come up on the beach at night, and they don't come up all at once. You know, 1 here, 2 there. So in a mile-long beach, you might have a dozen or less turtles coming up in one night. Here, they all come up around the same time, and what the natives do then is they just wait for the turtles to lay their eggs, and they take the eggs right out of the nest. 50 eggs go in the nest, they take 50 eggs out. 100 eggs go in the nest, they take 100 eggs out. And they eat them, you know, I mean, they have to live. But that's one of the reasons why they're so endangered. Here's primarily where they nest, in a certain section of Mexico called Rancho Nuevo, right on the coast. They do nest in a couple of places in Texas. They've been known to nest in Florida, 1 or 2 here or there, and one was even found nesting way up in Brooklyn, New York. But that's pretty much their range there. Gulf of Mexico, then up the eastern seaboard. But then they come back down primarily into the Gulf of Mexico to Mexico's coast to the nest. They have a cousin called the olive ridley sea turtle, about the same size, 2 foot long top shell. It's not as endangered, but it does have problems. It gets caught in nets, fishermen's nets, just like a lot of sea turtles. And because they're air-breathing reptiles, if they get caught in the net for too long, they could drown. Now, the fishermen don't really like that because now, since the sea turtles are endangered, they can't harvest them. So they're just dead weight in the net. So some genius came up with something called a turtle excluder device. It's like a little trap door that the turtles can swim through, and it shuts when the turtle gets out, so the fish don't get out. So it's a win-win situation, and that has helped turtle populations start to come back up. Now, the reason the olive ridley is not as endangered as its cousin is because, see all those places where it nests. So it's not as easy for people to locate the nest and take the eggs. And that's why it's thousands and thousands more olive ridleys than Kemps. It does do an aribata, but again, it's because it's worldwide, it's not so endangered. The TACL you see on the bottom, that's kind of standard for turtles. That's called typical adult carapace length. So a typical adult is going to have a 2-foot long top shell if it's a ridley. Okay, so now we're going to hit our last island, Jamaica. And Jamaica, like many of the islands, is noted for beautiful, beautiful beaches and resorts. Here's another one, close-up view. Again, not too populated right now because of the tourist problems. We're going to talk about the Jamaican slider now, not the sandwich, but the turtle. This turtle is not a sea turtle, but it does swim, so it has webbed feet. It can handle both fresh water and brackish water. That's water that's sort of a mix of salt and fresh, but it doesn't really go out in the ocean. It doesn't like the saline water found in the Gulf of the Atlantic Ocean. There's a close-up at the top shell, and you might notice that turtles in general don't have teeth. They have a sharp beak that they use to eat their food. And there's another close-up look at the plastron on the bottom of the turtle and the little bridge on the side. Notice it's not that big. It's about a foot long top shell. And it's a little feisty guy. Now, it's called the Jamaican slider, but it's also found in the Bahamas, but nobody knows for sure where it was first. Did the Bahamians bring it to Jamaica or vice versa? They really don't know. It can eat whatever it wants. It'll eat fish, it'll eat baby birds if they're not protected, it will eat algae and seaweed, pretty much whatever it wants. And the female is a little bit bigger than the male. That happens sometimes in turtles because the females have to carry the eggs. And while you're in Jamaica, you might want to stop off in the Bob Marley Museum. He's the guy that's very famous for reggae music that you heard at the beginning there. Now, if you want to know if a turtle is a tortoise or not, you have to look at their feet. It's not necessarily what they do, but you can find animals, turtles on dry land that aren't tortoises. All tortoises are turtles, but not all turtles are tortoises. So how do you know? Well, if you see a webbed foot or a clawed foot with long claws like this, or a flipper, then it's a turtle. If you see an elephant-like foot, sort of flat, heavy, thick foot with short nails, then it's a tortoise. So to make that more clear, here we have a Florida box turtle, which is only primarily found inland. It might get into shallow water once in a while to cool off, but it's primarily a land animal, but it's considered a turtle. It has that close-up of the foot you saw a minute ago. And it's an excellent climber with those claws. The red-footed tortoise is a tortoise. It's found all over the Caribbean, South America, Central America, and if you look at its feet more closely, they're heavy, heavy feet with short claws. And here's another close-up of the face of the turtle. You can see the beak. As I said, it's native to Central and South America. It's been found in Caribbean islands. They're not quite sure if it got there naturally or if old ancient peoples brought them there. But now it's found on a dozen or so different Caribbean islands. And the typical adult carapace length is 12 inches. Now, most people think tortoises and turtles are very gentle, harmless, slow creatures. But you can see this one is more than willing to harass the cat. So we're going to sail off into the rainbow, look for the pot of gold. And we want to thank all these people that either loaned us or we borrowed pictures from.